This is Making Better Decisions. I'm your host, Ryan Sullivan. Decisions are where rubber meets the road for organizations. Each week, we'll be learning from people who are on the front lines of turning raw data into better outcomes for their organizations. This show is sponsored by Canopy Analytic, helping companies make better decisions using data. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Making Better Decisions podcast. Today's guest started her career repairing Apache helicopters in the U.S. Army. Afterwards, she received both her JD and a Master's of Law in Intellectual Property Law. She worked for 23 years at Microsoft, ending as the CDO for Microsoft UK, with a notable stop as COO of Azure Data Engineering. She's a founding member of the European chapter of Women Leaders in Data and AI, or WILDA, and she holds multiple board seats. Please welcome Field Chief Data Strategy Officer at Databricks, Robin Sutara. Welcome to the show, Robin.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to today's conversation.
I'm excited too. What is the one thing you wish more people knew about using data to make better decisions?
Yeah, I think it's always so interesting. I have this conversation with my kids all the time, right? Where they keep saying, none of them are technical. I have 4 girls, and none of them are in technical fields. And they always say, like, we don't understand data. We don't use data. It's like, baby, you use data every day. Like every time you go to the grocery store and you're trying to make the decision on what brand of, X, Y, or Z to buy, you are using data in your head to calculate that out and what's the price per ounce and how do you make sure that you're getting the best value, et cetera. And so I wish people across organizations have this almost object reaction to data transformations. Why should we change the way that we're doing things? Would realize you're already using data every day in your personal life, in your work life. When you think about data transformation and really becoming data led or data driven or data sort of centric, it's just changing the operations and the processes and the way that you do things to make data more efficient and effective for you. So it's not trying to sort of displace all of that amazing knowledge that you have in your head. It's like trying to make sure that you have that right information at a time that allows you to make quicker decisions that are more effective and more efficient for the company. And so I think I really wish people would sort of come to the realization that data is not this outlier thing. It's not a new or novel concept. It is something that you're already using today. And so now how do you think about taking it to the next level of capability to allow you to be better and deliver better things?
That actually leads right into one of the things that I wanted to ask you. So you described your current role as exploring how to successfully implement data-driven transformations. Now, obviously, I'm bought in on this topic, but I'm curious to get your thoughts on why data should be a pillar to transform their organizations around.
Yeah, I think this is really evident when you go into organizations that have a long history of legacy. I think if you look at, some of the newer companies that have stood up, they are almost grounded in data. They started in data. They're born in data. If we look at some of the most successful organizations right now, they started in AI, right? They started sort of with this foundation of data and AI and technology to build upon. And amazingly, at Databricks, we have a great opportunity to work with lots of those organizations to drive success. I think the bigger issue I see is when organizations like when I was at Microsoft, where we had decades of a history of the way that we sort of did things, that we were trying to change the way, right, that people sort of approach that. And so when I think about data transformation, I do think about it more from people, process, operations point of view. Right, technology is evolving, absolutely, and you're able to deliver. ChatGPT definitely unlocked things like natural language to be really easily accessible, et cetera. But for most organizations, it's really rethinking, is there a way that we could revisit that manufacturing process that we've used for the last 300 years more effectively if we had the data and insight that would allow us to be more efficient. And I think this is really coming to a critical head when we think about things like GPU costs, et cetera. Every organization is trying to figure out how are they going to tackle the technical part of it, but in a way that's optimized and efficient and, not cost prohibitive to be able to drive those things forward. So I almost always feel like transformation circles back back to, are you looking at the people, the process, the operations, the capabilities that you have to be able to deliver?
Yeah, I think connecting your two answers, it's kind of like you're already doing this. For me, one of the, I think, great challenges as I've moved from being just like a purely technical, like I'm a dude that like writes code and understands data and all that stuff, to actually trying to be a business advisor. I think one of the big focuses there has been learning how to communicate to folks who do not do this as their exclusive job responsibility and career. What's the real value here? And for me, it all comes back to decisions and then the actions that we take as a result of those decisions. And to your point that you led off with, people are already making decisions. They might be making correctly or incorrectly informed decisions, or they may be slow, or they may be fantastic. But this process is absolutely already happening. I think it's a little bit more about a recognition of what is already happening and what the real realities are.
I think the other interesting point is like, particularly now when people are on this AI bandwagon. I mean, AI has been around for a while. I
Yeah.
think really the interesting part is, yes, there's some level of generative AI and large language models and sort of that direction, but there's also like the classical AI, right? The traditional AI. How do we automate some of these manual tasks now that we are sort of on this pursuit of becoming more data and AI driven or led, where organizations are creating the foundations that you can rethink some of
Mm.
these manual processes where it was a gut feel of a store manager located in location A, right? How do you get out of that so that you're doing things like auto ordering based on actual insight and data, and align it with weather data so that you know that they're going to have, right, supply chain issues coming up in the next 3 months, et cetera. Like all of that stuff that we have historically or traditionally done in an organization, and I think we continue to battle with this. I think every organization has some level of, I just know because I've been in the industry so long, or I have that domain expertise in the business that you don't trust when technology is coming to bear to displace those manual decisions that you used to make. What I always have to work with organizations is think about all the things that you could deliver if you weren't spending your time rationalizing 700 spreadsheets to determine how many rolls of toilet paper you need in the shelf in the store in Ohio, right? Like there's just so much art of the possible that's capable for human brain power to solve for if we weren't saddled with these. And I think the really interesting part right now is the people are starting to see how easily accessible it is to not have to have those skill sets you were talking about, to not have to know Python or SQL or, or any of those things now, to really start to think about how do you leverage technology in my day-to-day activity. And I get calls from my mom and my grandmother all the time, like, how do I use Chat GPT, right? How is this going to help? What can I do with it? Like, how can I help solve some things? So if you really think about it, it's just amazing how accessible that type of technology has become. But the problem is that also gives everybody the same competitive advantage, right? So for many organizations, it is bridging that gap with the business to say our unique value proposition is our intellectual property, our data, our trade secrets. Now how are we going to build our technology on top of that data and insights that no one else has, that's going to help us deliver faster, better, more efficiently, whether it's a commercial or societal impact? Absolutely. I think every organization is driving that way.
And I think what you said holds true for individuals and humanity as much as it holds true for organizations, businesses, what have you. I think that the general availability of these tools, which I agree have been around for a while, but have now, in the last few years, really captured the public's imagination and have gotten into a place where you now have a huge influx of money and new development talent going towards packaging and making things commercially available, which would have required a room full of PhDs and a big bag of money a long time ago. Um, and I think that it's sparking a reckoning of the human value proposition. And so I think about, okay, well, we talk a lot on the podcast around how, at least for something which is not automated, right? And I would argue the only difference between something that's like a report or an automation is just like, well, can the decision and action be done programmatically or with a neural net or something along those lines. But for the things that cannot be fully automated, that last mile is human. And so we have these, digestion biases and uh, technical limitations, internal politics, like all of these human elements. And so I'm interested to get your take as this revolution continues and as humans are forced to find out and then lean into the things that they're uniquely good at relative to machines, how do you see this going? What is your, I know this is a bit of a crystal ball question, but how do you see humans leaning into the things that they're good at and letting the machines take care of what they're good at?
I think that's still a journey that we're all going on, right? There is some level I think of, particularly if we look at the headlines across the news that we see, it's typically around hallucinations or a chatbot that responded inappropriately and somebody was negatively impacted. Granted, it hasn't been, life or death at this point. It's really been more commercial negative impact. So I think lots of organizations still continue to look at it to say, how are we really thinking about our approach to this in a way that we can bring people along on that journey? How can we work now to build up that comfort level as technology continues to get better so that we're mitigating some of those things like hallucinations, like drift, like all of those red flags that get raised. But my concern is more the other side of the coin, in which I look and I see things that are now very commonplace when you think of things like coding assistants, et cetera. How do we make sure that we're leveraging the mental capabilities and competencies of humans to look at the outputs to say, huge, huge way for me to get started. Now, how do I apply my unique value proposition on top of that? Right. So, for example, right, you leverage one of the assistants to help you draft some level of SQL code. My hope would be that the engineer has enough knowledge of how the process works, the fundamentals and basics, that they could look at it and say, oh, that doesn't quite look right, or that's not the results that I expected. Particularly if we think about things like gender biases in data sets, right? Things that are inherently going to be native in the system. You have to have that intellectual power to be able to look at it. And that's where I think if we can start to point out more of those examples for people to say, you have this domain area of expertise that nobody else has. You have these experiences that no one else has. This is why I often talk about, I think some of the most valuable contributors to the data community are those that have some other non-technical background in partnership of those that do have technical background. I love to hire people that have language background, that have social science, that have things like art and design, right? Things that are going to bring a different perspective to the solution. Because if everybody grew up in technology, you're only going to get one point of view. You're only going to get one sort of mental model approaching that. And so I think for everybody, as you think about the art of the possible now that technology is so accessible for everybody, what is that unique value contribution based on your experiences, your education, your life, your cultural background, your upbringing, your socioeconomic background? All of that makes you unique. And you can bring a point of view to this data and to the solutions that an organization is looking to drive. And I think that's the amazing power of technology, is now no longer the barrier to entry. Now we have the capability to bring all of these different point of views and make it accessible for everyone to create things like a dashboard that can actually be used across multiple facets of the business, because we're not just taking it from the point of view as the business analyst. We now can add domain area experts to say, to ask questions of that data, and they can ask it in natural language. So they don't have to know the SQL to now create yet another data point or another view. They can actually leverage the great platforms and capabilities that the technical team has laid out and created for them. And that's where I think people are going to have to start to shift their mentality. Instead of just thinking of technology as taking sort of business, taking your requirements, like I want a platform that's going to deliver X, Y, or a dashboard, right? That's going to show me X, Y, and Z. And oh, I wish I had data point A, B, and C on there. So let me put in a request to the data analyst, right? To the analytics team to come back and provide that for me, that will no longer be required because your analytics team is going to be providing you with sort of the platform and solutions that you can ask that question. Why do I have a right? Why do I have an outlier in the month of December of 2021 compared to right the rest of Europe in that same time period? Like I that type of thing is really going to help people, I think about only you would know to ask that question, right? Like only you are going to know how you want to sort of scrape against that data to solve the business problems. I always tell people when I talk to them, like, depending on the organization, I don't have your skill or attribution. If I'm talking to a R&D organization at a pharma company, those brilliant people have gone through lots of education to really think about how to develop, test, and release net new drugs that are going to solve, major illnesses like cancer and diabetes. That is not my background. I am not going to be able to come up with that solution. What I can do is sit with you to say, okay, of all those researchers, do they have access to the right current research and information that they need that they can then figure out what is the next step to solve for that? And that's where the power is when technology stops being the barrier.
Wow, that a lot there. There are kind of, I think, three separate threads there that I want to put a pin in before I start going into all of them. One is talking a little bit about removing some of the barriers to entry, and I actually want to treat that as a little bit larger than just like some of the technological barriers, because I think technology has gotten to a point where it actually enables new things instead of just no longer gets in the way. Um, the second being data as an really, really important underpinning of a lot of these future technologies that we're talking about, and how they're really kind of one thing. Um, and then the last being, you talked about how centralized analytics functions and data people such as myself are going to kind of start being responsible for, I wouldn't say a new thing, but the importance will be placed much more on the data engineering, metadata, all that kind of stuff, which is where I wanted to go anyways. The first thing that I'll go back to is that idea that you mentioned of kind of removing barriers and even opening new doors. And this is totally like a personal thing. I don't know if there's any research that's out there that says this is going to be magic, but when I first saw ChatGPT coming out and all of these tools and the things that were getting built, the thing that I selfishly imagined was, "Oh my gosh, I wish I had this when I was a kid."
Mm.
Like, I was the nerd that just, like, read the encyclopedia or, like, the Wikipedia just for hours and, like, consuming information. The digestibility of that is obviously much better, right? Like, I talked to my parents and they're like, "I had to write a paper, I had to go to the library and, like, find it physically on the page of a book." Like, you say control F and find whatever you want anywhere. But I even still just can't imagine the possibilities as far as a motivated learner being able to digest and get to new heights quicker than some of the large language model stuff that's out there. But it does bring me to your second point, which is, you were talking a little bit about, you used the example of gender bias in some of the underlying data. And whether it's gender bias or inaccuracy or some other type of bias, whether it's intentional or situational, like whatever it is, issues get super magnified by these tools because it creates an echo chamber. I'm curious to get your thoughts on that. Like, people will be, combining those 2 points, people will be able to accelerate to these amazing futures, but a lot of what got them there may get hollowed out and may be based on things that down at the ground level, the foundation level, are a little bit shaky. How do we handle that?
I think this is where it comes back to your original point of how do we make sure that people feel the right to question, right? Or have at least, I have to tell my 23-year-old kid all the time, like, that isn't the what happened like in 1982, right? I was there. I can tell you that is not what happened, right? And so just this blind trust, I think is, I think you're right for the voracious learner, for the one that this is just unlocks the power of all of this insight that they didn't have at their fingertips before, and right, being able to summarize it in a can right easily digestible way and sort of the quick I always sort of say I feel like I'm in this instant gratification mode lately, right? Like I no longer have to read 700-page white papers. Like, please just summarize it to 2 pages and let me get the salient points of it, which works if I'm setting up boundaries. When I'm saying, hey, whatever provider, please provide me, right, the definition of economics and the history of it through the course of history. It will be biased because we've written history books in some level of bias, and so do I, are we encouraging enough critical thinking to sort of question? And this is why I said it is that domain area of expertise that are going to have to keep pushing the boundaries to say, wait a minute, that's not right, right? Like we need to figure out how do we incrementally add net new data into the ecosystem that is going to help us shape and correct where there may be inherent biases as a result in the data. How are we creating net new data sets that are going to, contribute and be allocated? For example, I do a lot of work with women in data out of it originally started in the UK, and they're doing global expansion now into the US and in India. And they are doing some really interesting work, for example, around women's health. Like, how do we create net new data sets? Because a lot of the existing data is just based on men, white males, the age of 35, that weigh 160 pounds. That is not most of the society today. And so, how do we really think about incremental data that those that have that domain area of expertise are going to question? And now we can start thinking about how do we get that new data? How do we generate that new data? Whether it's all right, creating that new studies, whether it's creating new data, whether that data exists somewhere else and we just haven't fed it into the ecosystem. There's lots of opportunities, but it is going to require those people that have that expertise to sort of question the results that they're getting out of it. And I think that's what's so fascinating about the time that we're in now is that requires people that aren't maybe strictly technical in their capabilities and competencies. It is going to require people that have knowledge of history, knowledge of right, arts, not knowledge of sciences, knowledge of all of these other areas of expertise. Those are going to be the ones that are going to have to be the rationality check to say that doesn't look right.
Yeah. I was gonna save this for a little bit later, and I know that we have a third point. I have some notes. We can circle back to it, but you brought it up. I mean, so I was originally like big time science nerd, wanted to be a doctor. Turned out that I math was easier for me, and that put me on a different track. And I'm very happy with where I ended up. And in fact, to a large degree because of this, right? Like some of what's going on in healthcare, I find deeply troubling and frustrating. And in particular, that issue, like as someone that sits, I mean, less and less so every day, but kind of at the intersection of science and medicine, and then also data technology, there are very few examples in history that are more infuriating than the idea that we had based all of our treatment research on a tiny uniform subset of the human population and expected those results to be extendable. Like, as someone who even has taken a stats 101 class, this is baffling to me. To your point on getting women in particular more involved, that to me is such an obvious point of like, if there had been a woman in the room, I feel like she would have been like, hey guys, like, do you think it's a good idea to put some women in these studies on these drugs that they're going to ultimately take? So, talk to me a little bit about how we can get more women involved in data and then also in leadership positions, which are data enabled.
I think that does require us as an industry to start thinking about the other capabilities, competencies, and skills that we can bring into the room and being explicit
Mm,
about that. It is so fascinating to me when people reach out to say, hey, I'm hiring for this role. Can you look at it and reach out to your network on who might be a qualified, diverse candidate? And I look at the job description, and I think I wouldn't even apply for this job. There's like 25 requirements, right? You
mm,
want somebody, I love when it says like, experience with Databricks for 20 years, considering that it's an 11-year-old company, that would be phenomenal if somebody has that much experience, right, with Databricks. I just think sometimes we don't think about what are really the net new capabilities and competencies that we want to introduce into the data team, into our leadership team, that are going to help us round out the great capabilities we already have on the team? What's the net new add, right? We can't just keep looking for these cookie cutters or unicorns of the same type of persona that we have today, the same educational background, the same sort of technical track that they've come up, et cetera. The only way that we are going to solve these problems is be super, super, I think, deliberate about seeking across the ecosystem and attracting new talent by not making them have the 25 requirements that, the traditional candidate would have. Do they really need to know R, right? Do they to come work on the data science team? Maybe they do need to learn it, but is that something that they can learn? Do they have some other knowledge or capability that they could bring to the team that would be complementary while we teach them the technical part of it? And I think sometimes we view technology as the minimum bar, which for some roles it absolutely is. But I think for other, we need to start being more open about how do we bring on the other skills and competencies and allow them, if they're passionate, particularly about technology, give them the opportunity to learn while in the role and bringing that net new sort of value contribution that they have to offer the team.
I have seen this, and I think this is much more general than just gender focused diversity, but
Yeah.
the types of roles that we talk about on this podcast that you and I have had are, I would argue, very different from the molds that a lot of your kind of like business program type stuff focus on. I think that there has, for good reason, been an exceptional focus on manufacturing type jobs. We re-engineered our work week, we re-engineered our education system around the industrial revolution, and I kind of feel like as we're now hitting this next major revolution, we're hearing some death rattles from that structure. And I think that the assumption that underlies what you just talked about, at least in my perspective, is that hiring somebody onto a very technical and, creative, thought-based role is not commoditized. This is not a role that has these check boxes and I can plug any number of a population of people into. Exactly as you talked about. We're talking about trying to build a mesh network of individual humans. And so just looking at a resume for certain check boxes, or even one of the things that I've touted as being much better than that, something like, all right, let's look at a hiring test and test them in their job responsibilities. Even all of those things treat technical and data roles as if the people filling them are commoditized. What's a better way to think about it?
I always feel like when you are looking at people and organizations, you have to think about it from a people point of view, right? If I think about every transformation, either in an organization I've been in, right, that a team or a part of the organization that I've lived in and worked in and tried to do a
Mhm.
transformation, or customers that I worked with, almost all of them will fail because we don't have the right capabilities and competencies from the people. It's not that we don't have the best of intentions. It's not that we don't have a plan. It's not that we don't have, the technical platform or data products and tools that could help them be able to deliver. We fail because we don't have the right people in place that have the knowledge and the capabilities to think about how am I going to transform my job as a result of that going away? What is the net new value I'm going to bring to the organization? How can I deliver better patient care? How am I going to provide better citizen services as a result of this? And because we have hired people that are only within this certain niche or this certain area of expertise, that's all they know. And people don't like to change. And so if I look at every failed transformation, and I think there's plenty of Harvard Business Review studies about this, almost all of them have failed because of the people. So if you take all of this from the people perspective, you have to think about, is it truly representative of those that you're serving or the customers or clients that you're trying to attract? I think you raise a really interesting point about sort of this, this throng of centralizing around the industrial revolution. Why do we not have more technical data type of classes at elementary school? Like, why are we not thinking about revamping our education systems to start making it a natural course and as opposed to optional in later studies. Why are we not allowing every student in the education system to get some level of exposure to this? There's so many different roles in data and technology these days that people will gravitate toward these types of roles if you just show them the breadth of the things that they can do and deliver. Yes, you can still love medicine or science or any of those things. And here's how it translates and how technology enables and supports that. And it should be naturally part of and then we start getting rid of the inherent nature of people to say, I don't want to use technology. I don't use data. It's not going to help me ever do my job. If we create the foundations at the very beginning, it should become a natural part. It is in the personal life. I can guarantee you this generation that's coming up as a result, particularly interesting out of COVID, where everybody in the education system had to rely on technology. So every child had to figure out how they were going to get connected into school, et cetera. We had to figure out how are we going to reach the socioeconomic communities that didn't have easier access to technology. Why is that not standard? Why are we not thinking about post-industrial revolution and the technical revolution that we're living in now and rethinking things like the things that we're preparing communities for, the capabilities that they have to be able to meet some of those expectations so that we can bring up this next generation and maybe get rid of some of these biases, right? If we ensure everybody has access to technology, it's part of the inherent educational system that it's not focused on industry, it's focused on technology. And how do we really then start creating a flywheel of the next generation that's going to lead to the next evolution of transformation?
I'm not sure I'm going to be able to top that. So I want to circle back to the third point that I buried the lead on earlier, which is you'd mentioned that the role of folks in data, I mean, to say that it's going to change is a bit of an understatement, but I think more specifically, the weighting of what is most important is going to shift a little bit more towards what I think you and I would put under the umbrella of data engineering, right? So like the provision of the collection, cleaning, provision, structuring,
Mhm.
metadata, all of those good things. I actually, based on your experience, had written a question on this. So your time on the Azure data engineering team, and now also your time at Databricks, I think put you in a situation to be an expert in how data engineering fits into a larger data ecosystem. I think that I agree with you that the importance of data engineering is only going to skyrocket. However, obviously a person can't be good at everything in data. And I do tend to lean towards this area in my own professional practice. Sure, I can do visualization and I can, some of the strategy business stuff is very exciting to me, but like I like to write code. So this is the place where I do it.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I've found with organizations is I already view this stuff as critical, but it's not visible, certainly not visible enough. And I find that at least the way most organizations go about doing it, the ROI is not tangible and is not short term. It facilitates all of these other massively leveraged return operations where you can just go out and like do better, faster analysis, all these wonderful things. But how can people like you and I that are good at data engineering, that see how it fits into the bigger picture, that believe in that long term vision, get it to generate return on investment or at least communicate the timeline around that return so that folks will continue to stay invested in those types of operations?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. Now I'm gonna say you have 3 points, yeah, that you raised.
Yeah, yeah.
I think there's a few things in there. One is I find data engineering to be super fascinating right now because I do think I don't know if you've had a chance to sort of look at some of the announcements that Databricks made back in June at our Data and AI Summit. It's coming up again in the upcoming June. So if anybody's interested, check out databricks.com. Tickets are available now that you can come to San Francisco. One of the things we're really focused on is how do we leverage the data intelligence platform? So the acquisition of Mosaic ML into the platform so that we can now run, right, it helps you build AI, but it also runs AI on the platform. And one of the big things that the engineering team was thinking about, it was how do we disrupt data engineering? If we think about all of the manual work that poor data engineering teams have to go through and the volume of data and net new data being created, is there's no short right, there's no shortness of a list of backlog for most data engineering teams on getting that work done. So what are the parts of the data engineering around building the pipelines, ingesting the data, cleaning it, applying the business rules, validating the quality, et cetera? How much of that can we automate, leveraging the intelligence that we have out of the platform? I think you will see major investments into that space over the next 6 to 12 months, right? I really think that we will see some of those things. How do we start to automate some of that so our data engineering teams can focus on the most complex parts of that? I think that will be fascinating over the short term. The other question you have is how do we start to articulate the ROI or the value of that work and the data assets in and of itself? And there's been lots of approaches, I think, that organizations have sort of taken to this. It's, if we look at the data products and services that are built on top, what is the value that is driving? What's the actual revenue? What's the operational cost savings? I love the one that says, look, if you were to lose that data, what's the cost to recreate it? I think that's a fascinating way to look at it, particularly when you're talking about, right, your internal data that's unique to you. So it's one thing to say, I acquired this data from, this outside source that I could easily repay my license or whatever and get it back. When you start to think about your internal data that only you have access to, particularly for organizations that have been around for a while, so you have some level of, historical customer data, historical manufacturing data, historical supply chain that is unique to your business. How much would it cost you to recreate that if you lost it? So I would highly recommend if you're a data engineering leader and you're trying to think about that, don't think about just the end products, but also think about the unique value that it has inside the company. Treat it no differently than you would trade secrets, right? The secret Coca-Cola recipe locked in a safe. I mean, that is exactly how you should treat that data because it is specific to you and unique to you. And I think that's what's so fascinating about today's era is it's not about scouring the internet for insight, et cetera, which is right, helpful at times. But the real value I see from organizations is how are you using this technology? How are you using data and AI on your data, on your unique data? And how do you make sure that you're protecting that data while meeting regulatory requirements, by the way, right? I think there's lots of facets there. But if you're a data engineering leader and you're struggling to articulate ROI, think about the end products, but also think about value for recreation.
I absolutely love that. That is rock solid advice. There's one last little thing that I want to dig into on this topic before moving on. One of the things being primarily a Microsoft guy that I've seen is that the big play with OneLake and Dataverse and all that kind of stuff is okay, well, we're going to generate a standard information architecture schema and then build everything else off of that. And then we just figure out how all of these individual sources connect to that. Now, obviously, every organization is different. I personally am of the belief that information architecture and that kind of like metadata type stuff is what's going to unlock all of these modern tools, real capabilities to accelerate. Like you talked about being able to, what was the word that you used? Disrupt data engineering. I personally think that information architecture, if that nut gets cracked, is what is going to facilitate the real large scale disruption of data engineering. Do you agree with that or do you have a different take?
No, I think absolutely. I mean, if you think about it from the Databricks perspective, I mean, that's exactly what we think about when you think about Unity Catalog, right? We call it a catalog, but it really is more about metadata management. How do we think about what data do we have? Organizations still, it amazes me that don't even know what data exists across the organization. So how do you actually think about discoverability, observability, sort of the quality issues, et cetera. All of that based on metadata management. Do I say that's an engineering problem solely? Probably not. Where I tend to find that that falls is actually to the business because they don't actually understand either the business logic that goes behind it when they created that data in the first place, or they don't feel a sense of ownership around entering in quality data into the ecosystem. So poor data engineering teams, if you get poor quality set of data, that there is very little that you're going to be able to do to go back and correct it without having the business semantics or the master data management sitting on top of that to be able to articulate that across the business. And so I almost feel like for most organizations, we're missing that handshake between the business and the organizations and setting clear roles and responsibilities and accountabilities. Typically, what I recommend for most organizations is how do you think about it as almost like a governance steer co, where you bring representation from engineering, from data science, from data analytics, from the business, from legal, from CISA, right? Your security office. Lots of people have a vested interest in how we think about master data management. How are we as an organization going to set up policies and controls? How are we going to enable the organization to think about data as they're doing things like entry, et cetera? So that because it's such a broad life cycle, I think it spans beyond just data engineering. But I do think it's the future. I think if you think about all of the issues that most organizations have when it comes to getting their data ingested, cleansed, ready for actual usage and consumption and automation, et cetera, a lot of it falls back to master data management. And so I do think that will be critical over the next 12 months or so.
I am a huge aviation nerd. I can't help but ask, what was it like working on Apaches?
Yeah, it was amazing. I have to admit. So when I was in high school, you talked about that you wanted to be a doctor. I actually wanted to fly SR-71s, right? The Blackbird stealth.
Only the most incredible plane ever made. Yeah.
Exactly. My dad worked at Boeing. I actually had a life-size poster of the cockpit in my bedroom. That was absolutely what I was going to do. I left for university to study computer engineering to eventually go, and then I ran out of money. So yeah, I had to figure out another way to pay for university. And fortunately for me, you're right. When I did my entrance exam, I had the option to go work on the Apaches. At the time, what I really loved about it was bleeding edge technology. I think it's so funny. In my car, I now have a heads up display. And I remember that being net new innovation on the Apache helicopters. And so it was just phenomenal. I had the opportunity to serve at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, as well as in Korea for on the around the DMZ for a year or so. Great people, phenomenal opportunity. But I really love the fact that it was aviation combined with technology, and ultimately led me to data. Right? Interesting. I was at Fort Campbell. Microsoft came up with this little product called Excel, and we were going to use it sort of track our parts. And because it was a computer and a typing job, that it fell to the woman. So I was super, super lucky that I fell into data early, thinking about how do we leverage Excel more effectively against the Apache. So I feel like I had the best of all worlds there for a little bit. I was in aviation, technology, and got to figure out data all at the same time.
Yeah, that's very cool. I'm jealous. Robin, we've gotten the opportunity to hear a ton of your expertise. I'm curious, outside of work, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, as I mentioned, mom of four girls. I'm super fortunate that they're all older and almost out of the house. One left in university. The other three off on their own world. So outside of work, which I travel quite a bit, I do a lot of endurance training. So love to sort of train for triathlons. Find it difficult to swim at hotels while I'm on the road, but we
Mm,
figure it out. And so right now, just primarily doing marathon training. And then in my spare time, I mentioned earlier Women in Data, which is an organization that's really centered on getting gender diversity representation in data at all levels. And so it's a phenomenal community that's targeted at everything from girls in data, at the education systems, and what are the contributions that we as a community can make into that, in addition to existing structures, and how do we try to change some of that, to women that are looking to do career pivots or career changes, which I'm a firm believer in. I mean, most people would not go from Apache helicopters to data roles, right? It's just not an obvious transition. And so how do I help that next generation of career transitions to entry level, right out of college, looking for their first job, all the way up to senior females in data. And so I think it's just a phenomenal, phenomenal community. So in my little bit of spare time, I try to dedicate to them because I do think it's such an opportunity for that community to come together, to support each other, to create net new opportunities. So if you're interested in that, womenindata.co.uk. Please, females, allies, all levels of diversity, like you referred to. It's not just gender, but that is what the organization is focused on. But if you're a supporter of that, would love to have you join the community and support us in that way. And then, yeah, the rest of my time is with Databricks. So again, if you're interested in the Databricks Summit, I'll be in San Francisco in June. So if you have any listeners that want to meet up in person, would love to share with you a little bit about what Databricks is doing out of that event.
Awesome. Outside of those methods you just mentioned, what's a great way to connect with you if anybody wants to?
Yeah, I think LinkedIn is probably the best. I tend to check in there quite frequently, so feel free to connect. More than happy to help and appreciate again the opportunity to connect with you and the listeners. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Robin, I was just about to say the same thing. This was such a phenomenal conversation. I looked up at the clock and was like, "Oh my gosh, I still want to talk for another 3 hours." I could have just kept going and going. Uh, your ideas really challenged mine, and I found my questions really morphing as you talked. It was a really fun experience, and I hope I was, for the listener's sake, able to keep up with you there. So, thanks so much for coming and sharing a little bit of your time and your expertise with us.
Thank you.
I also want to make sure to thank the listeners. If you guys have made it this far, please make sure to tell a friend that you liked us, like, subscribe, give us a review, hopefully a good one, whatever platform you want. Doesn't matter. Just make sure it's a 5-star review. Really helps keep some fuel in the engine, keep us going. Robin, thank you again so much for coming on. And this has been another episode of the Making Better Decisions podcast. Thanks for listening. That's a wrap for today's episode of Making Better Decisions. For show notes and more, visit makingbetterdecisions.live. A special thank you to our sponsor, Canopy Analytic. Canopy Analytic is a boutique consultancy focused on business intelligence and data engineering. They help companies make better decisions using data. For more information, visit canopyanalytic.com. There's a better way. Let's find it together and make better decisions. Thank you so much for listening. We'll catch you next week.